We've had a lot of great blocks of speakers on related topics throughout our WordCamp, but the stretch that we're currently in on this track was one of my favorites, or is one of my favorites. It's about contributing to WordPress. And in October of last year, I participated as one of the organizing team members for WordPress Accessibility Day. And Stefano was on the team as well. And although we were thousands of miles apart as a team, it was a great way to meet him. And I'm glad to introduce him to you today to talk about contributing to WordPress, but from an accessibility standpoint. Stefano is a self-employed, all-around website manager for small local businesses. He describes himself as a front-end developer and an accessibility specialist, but he is curious about all aspects of website building. He joined the WordPress community in early 2018. Since then, he's tried his best to give back by speaking and co-organizing WordPress events and by contributing to the WordPress accessibility team. He's been one of the accessibility team representatives for the past year, and he's one of the co-organizers of the aforementioned WordPress Accessibility Day. When he isn't busy bothering his friends by talking about WordPress, he sings in a choir and goes ballroom dancing. And of course, that's before the pandemic. A few months ago, he also rediscovered his passion for playing chess. Please join me in welcoming Stefano as he presents contributing to the accessibility of WordPress. Stefano, take it away.
Hello everyone. I'm happy to be here once more on the virtual stage of WordCamp Santa Clarita Online. As you see, this presentation is pre-recorded, and while you're watching it, I'm probably sleeping because it's 5:30 in the morning in Italy, where I live. But you never know. In case I manage to wake up, I'll find a way to let you know, so that if you have a question, I can answer it in real time, since there's no Q&A after this session. Otherwise, you'll find my contacts at the end of the presentation. Just drop me a line and I'll answer to you as soon as possible. Before I start, I want to thank once more the organizers for allowing me here, and also huge thanks to the captioners who are working to make this event even more accessible. So, my presentation will be about contributing to WordPress accessibility. And I want to tell you a funny story about how I got started. It was June 2018. I had joined the WordPress community 5 months earlier, and I was in Belgrade for WordCamp Europe, the second WordCamp of my entire life. It was Contributor Day, and I went straight for the accessibility table. By the way, it was on that occasion that I met Rian Rietveld for the first time. I already had some notions about accessibility, and I wanted to learn something new. What was not very clear to me at the time was that contributor days are really meant to contribute to WordPress. Knowing basically nothing, I spent the entire morning trying to figure out what I could do. And after lunch, I realized that the only thing that I could really do was to stand up and change table. But before leaving, I had a talk with Sami Keijonen and Adrian Roselli, who gave me a lot of suggestions on resources to get started with accessibility in general and WordPress accessibility in particular. When I went back home, I followed their suggestions and began to study more deeply. I joined the weekly meetings online, and little by little, I started to give my very little personal contribution to WordPress accessibility. Now, before we go a little more in depth into what the accessibility team does, let's quickly review the definition of accessibility. According to the Web Accessibility Initiative, accessibility addresses discriminatory aspects related to equivalent user experience for people with disabilities. This means that the goal of the accessibility team is to allow users with disabilities to use WordPress and to get the same exact results as users who do not have disabilities. I want to underline that user experience is not accessibility. It's a related discipline, but accessibility focuses especially on the needs of people with disabilities. And in the context of WordPress, I want to make it clear that an accessibility issue is not a problem with the login screen. You have no idea how many times we have to explain that to new contributors who open tickets on track. So, what does the accessibility team do? As stated in the WordPress accessibility coding standards, code integrated into the WordPress ecosystem, which includes WordPress core, WordPress.org websites, WordPress default themes, and official plugins, is expected to conform to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG for short, version 2.1 at level AA. Also, new and updated interfaces are encouraged to incorporate the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines, version 2.0. What the accessibility team does is to provide expertise across the project to improve the accessibility of all these components. Which, if you think about it, it's a lot of work. Staying up to date with all of this has always been a struggle, which is why, about 8 months ago, the accessibility team decided to organize internally by creating 7 working groups, each of them addressing a specific aspect of WordPress accessibility. Ideally, each working group should have a referent who is responsible for reporting to the rest of the team about what the working group is working on and for asking for help in case of need. Unfortunately, not all teams have a referent, but we are almost always able to get updates from at least a member of each working group. Such updates are shared regularly, usually twice a month, during the weekly accessibility team meeting, which I'm going to talk about later. The 7 working groups are, in strict alphabetical order, Design, Documentation, General, Gutenberg, Media, Meta, and Themes. Let's quickly have a look at each of them. You'll see that there are tons of different ways to contribute to WordPress accessibility, and you'll almost surely find something that interests you. The Design Working Group addresses all issues shared between the accessibility team and the design team. The Documentation Working Group is in charge of improving the team's documentation, which is formed by the Accessibility Team Handbook, the Accessibility Coding Standards, and the Pattern Library, a collection of good and bad practices which should be respectively followed and avoided when designing and implementing WordPress interfaces. This is one of the most active working groups, and they have been working hard in the last few months to update all the documentation to reflect the switch from WCAG version 2.0 to WCAG version 2.1. The General Working Group is in charge of all accessibility aspects which are not addressed by other working groups. Their main focus is working on improving the accessibility of WordPress core by holding weekly bug scrubs, where core track tickets which have the accessibility focus are analyzed to see how they can be moved forward. The Gutenberg Working Group is in charge of addressing accessibility issues of the block editor, including its latest addition, full site editing. The Media Working Group is in charge of addressing accessibility issues found in the media library. Given the complexity of this component, it was decided to split this working group from the general one. The Meta Working Group is in charge of addressing accessibility issues of all WordPress.org websites. The Themes Working Group is in charge of addressing accessibility issues in the default themes, which are the ones whose names starts by 20, such as 2021. Also, they are in charge of reviewing themes that want to get the accessibility ready tag on the official repository. We talked about WordPress core. We talked about WordPress themes, but how about WordPress plugins? Well, the accessibility team doesn't do any check to plugins in the WordPress repository. Still, some developers work to make their plugins fully accessible, but it's their entire responsibility, and they don't have a tag to mark that they have been checked like accessibility-ready themes. Nevertheless, feature plugins, which are plugins developed by members of the WordPress community to test features for possible inclusion into core, have to conform to the WordPress accessibility coding standards, just like as if they were already included in core. So these plugins are actually checked for accessibility. The most famous example of a feature plugin is Gutenberg. Okay, so you're convinced about starting to contribute to WordPress accessibility. Where to begin? It's possible that you already know about both the WordPress community and accessibility, in which case, where have you been until now? Please jump on board, we really need your help and you should have no problem in getting started. If you are an accessibility specialist or an accessibility advocate, but you're new to contributing to WordPress, the best way to get started is probably to attend weekly meetings and bug scrubs. This is because WordPress is an open source software, and like all OSS, you'll need some time to get acquainted with how its community works. For example, it's very common for new contributors not to understand why during bug scrubs we avoid long discussions on possible technical solutions for specific track tickets. That's because it's very easy for discussion happening on Slack to be lost. Also, if you have a problem with Gutenberg, the best place to report it is on GitHub and not on Track. I understand that you probably want to jump right away into contributing and solve the issue you discovered as soon as possible. But with a little understanding, you'll be up and running very soon. If you're new to accessibility, instead, the best idea to get started is probably to build yourself a little knowledge. There are a lot of resources out there. If you have no idea about where to start, maybe you should follow the same suggestions that Sami gave me in Belgrade and begin with what you can find on the accessibility team website. For example, the WordPress accessibility coding standards now include a very short introduction to web content accessibility guidelines, and also have a couple of sections with authoritative resources that you can rely on for extra information, and a list of links if you need help with specific technical topics. In the accessibility team handbook, you'll find a lot of suggestions on how to improve the accessibility of your WordPress website. There are resources for content creators, designers, and developers. Whatever is your starting point, you'll find something that fits your need. But in practice, what should you do? The first thing to do is to join the accessibility team online. First, you need to choose a username and create a WordPress profile. Then, you can use your profile username to sign up on the WordPress Slack instance. The accessibility channel is the main place for discussion, but there are also channels dedicated to testing, documentation, events, and so on. Just remember to avoid threads, as they are not accessible. And most important, feel free to ask questions. It's the best way to get started quickly. Second, and most important, participate to the weekly meetings and bug scrubs. Meetings happen in the accessibility channel on Slack every Friday at 16 UTC, which is 8 Pacific Daylight Time, quite early in the morning. Bug scrubs start 1 hour before the meetings, that is, very early in the morning. We always start the meeting by welcoming participants who attend for the first time. So, once more, you're more than invited to join us. And don't be afraid to share your thoughts. The moment you start to interact is the moment you start to contribute. At the moment, we are still waiting for in-person events to start again. But a very common way to join the accessibility team was to show up at the accessibility table during the contributor day of a WordCamp. I really hope I'll be able to meet you in person there. And I really hope that doing so would be possible very soon. A very nice way to start to contribute to the accessibility of WordPress is probably to contribute by testing. If you are a developer or you are already familiar with how patches can be tested, a good way to start to understand accessibility problems is to see how they can be solved. But there's another way of testing which is equally useful. Trying to use WordPress using assistive technologies and see if you can get the same results that you would get without using them. This is one of the most effective ways to find new bugs, and finding bugs is the first step towards solving them. If you want to start to test websites, the WordPress dashboard, and feature plugins, including Gutenberg, by using assistive technologies, probably the best idea is to begin by learning how to navigate using only the keyboard. People with limited mobility can't use the mouse effectively, so they have to rely on the keyboard to navigate. And if a website works when using only the keyboard, it's more than probable that everyone would be able to navigate it. You don't have to become a keyboard-only power user, but at least learning the basic keys might be already enough to get the idea of the difficulties these people have to face. Another assistive technology which is very commonly used in testing is the screen reader, which, as the name indicates, is a software that reads the elements found on a computer screen. Together with keyboard navigation, this is the only way a blind person can use a computer. So people without vision rely on that. If you want to try a screen reader, just start with the one included in your operating system. Most of them have one. Or, if you use Windows, just go for NVDA. It's free and it's open source. After the creation of working groups, I'm very convinced that another good way to start contributing would be to write documentation. On one side, writing documentation is a very good way to learn about the things you are documenting. Second, if you are new to accessibility, you probably know the needs of people who are new to accessibility and WordPress. So you are in a better position to understand what they are looking for. This is why it shouldn't shock you that the documentation working group has been one of the most attractive working groups for new contributors inside the accessibility team. Next step in contributing to WordPress accessibility will probably be starting to comment on track tickets and on Gutenberg issues, and also to intervene in weekly meetings. You'll probably need some time to understand how to give valuable information on a ticket, on an issue, to make it move more quickly. But volunteering to summarize discussions occasionally happening in the channel during meetings and bug scrubs is probably a nice way to start to become more active. And finally, if you want to get your hands dirty with code, you can even decide to contribute by writing patches and making pull requests. At the beginning, it can be intimidating to think about tackling very complex issues, but remember that there are some tickets and issues with the good first bug label, which indicates that the related patch should be very easy to write, even for a newbie. So, to conclude, I joined the accessibility team about 3 years ago. Despite having attended almost every weekly meeting and bug scrub for the last 2 years, I'm perfectly aware that there are a lot of accessibility topics I know very little about. And I still ask questions both about accessibility and the WordPress workflow. Nevertheless, I learned a lot, and thanks to that, I'm definitely more aware about accessibility than the vast majority of people, which is very exciting and very worrying at the same time. I can't promise you'll have the same great experience I'm having at contributing to WordPress accessibility. But if you don't try it, you'll never know. Which is why I really hope to see you next week at the weekly Accessibility Teams meeting. And with that, we're done. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and in case you have questions, you can write me an email to ryokuhionwp@gmail.com, spelled RYOKUHIONWP@gmail.com. Or you can contact me on various social media, either under my name, Stefano Minoia, or my nickname, Ryokuhi. Thanks again, and see you soon.